Rude cop mocks poor guy. Instantly regrets it when he learns who he is. The streets were packed as usual. Cars honked, people rushed past one another, all in their own little worlds. It was the kind of day that felt normal on the surface. But not everything that looks normal really is. Officer Thomas had been with the force for over 20 years. He knew these streets like the back of his hand. Every alley, every shortcut, every face. Or at least he thought he did. He was sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup in his patrol car, eyes scanning the sidewalks like always. His routine was the same every day, and honestly, he liked it that way. But suddenly, something caught his eye. A sleek black car turned onto the road ahead. It was spotless. New model. Chrome rims, windows slightly tinted. It moved with the kind of smoothness that told you it wasn't just any car. And behind the wheel sat a young black man, maybe late 20s, wearing a clean suit, watch gleaming on his wrist. Confident, calm, smiling even. Thomas sat up straighter. Something about it didn't sit right with him. He tossed the empty cup on the floor and flipped on his patrol lights. The car hadn't broken any laws, no speeding, no missed signals. But Thomas didn't need a reason. His gut told him something. And to him, gut feelings meant everything. The siren echoed down the street. The black car's brake lights blinked, and it slowly pulled over. Inside the car, Jordan had just been going over his notes. Today was a big day. First day at his new job, a corporate role he'd worked years to earn. All the late nights, all the doubting voices, all the pressure. Today was finally the start of something better. He straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and reached for his ID, already knowing what was coming next. This wasn't his first time being pulled over for simply existing in the wrong place with the wrong skin color. Thomas approached the car, slowly, hand resting near his holster, jaw tight. He leaned down, looking through the window. "License and registration," he said flatly. "No, hello." No reason given. Jordan stayed calm. "Sure, officer," he said politely, reaching slowly for his documents. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" Thomas narrowed his eyes, ignoring the question. He glanced at the license, then back at the car. "This your vehicle?" he asked, with a tone that already assumed it wasn't. "Yes, sir," Jordan replied, his voice steady. "I just got it a few months ago." Thomas stared at him like he didn't believe a word of it. "What do you do for work?" "I'm starting a new job today," Jordan said. "Vice president at a firm downtown." The officer scoffed under his breath. "Right," he said, clearly not buying it. "Vice president, in that car." Jordan didn't flinch. He just gave a small nod. "That's right." Thomas looked around the car again, as if hoping to spot something out of place. Something to prove his assumption right. When he didn't, he turned without another word and walked back to his patrol car. Jordan sat still, fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly. He didn't want to be late on his first day, but he knew better than to rush this moment. He could feel people starting to look. Pedestrians slowed down, glancing his way. Some even stopped. He was being turned into a scene again. Back in the patrol car, Thomas ran Jordan's info through the system. Clean. No tickets, no record. Everything checked out. But something in Thomas refused to let it go. He got out again and walked back. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Jordan looked confused. "Did I do something wrong?" Thomas didn't answer, just motioned toward the sidewalk. Jordan got out slowly. The officer started asking more questions about his job, his background, his car payments. All of it laced with the same disbelief, like he couldn't wrap his head around the idea that someone like Jordan could possibly belong behind the wheel of such a nice car. It wasn't about traffic anymore. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. Jordan stayed composed, even as the questions got more personal, more invasive. Mind if I search your vehicle? Thomas finally asked, though his tone wasn't really asking. Jordan could have said no. He had every right, but he didn't want trouble. Not today. Go ahead, he said quietly. As Thomas opened doors, checked under seats, even popped the trunk, Jordan stood by on the sidewalk, surrounded by stares. He felt his chest tighten, but he didn't show it. This wasn't new. But it never got easier. After several minutes, the officer came back, empty-handed. You're clean, he said, almost like it disappointed him. Jordan looked at him for a moment, calm, unshaken, then asked quietly, Am I free to go? Thomas nodded once. But just before walking off, he leaned in and muttered something Jordan would never forget. You don't belong here. Remember that. Jordan didn't react. He didn't argue. He just got back in the car, started the engine, and drove off toward the biggest meeting of his life, leaving behind the flashing lights, the humiliation, and the man who had no idea who he had just messed with. The city kept moving as Jordan drove away, but the heaviness in his chest didn't. His grip on the wheel was tight. He kept his face steady, but inside, his heart was pounding. This wasn't new to him, but somehow, this one cut deeper. Maybe it was because today was supposed to be different. Maybe because it reminded him that no matter how far he had come, there were still people who only saw his skin and not the man behind it. He tried to shake it off, but the officer's words echoed in his head. You don't belong here. Jordan. Pulled into an underground parking garage, cut the engine, and just sat there for a moment in silence. He looked down at his ID badge, brand new, crisp, his name printed right under the company's logo. A reminder that he did belong here, that he had earned this. Every late night, every interview, every rejection he turned into motivation. He wasn't given this role. He fought for it. And he won. But still, the look in that officer's eyes, that disbelief, that assumption. Jordan took a slow breath. He couldn't afford to let that moment follow him upstairs. He had a job to do, a big one. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, Officer Thomas sat back in his cruiser with a smug look on his face. His partner had joined him now, sipping a soda and listening with half interest as Thomas recounted the stop. You should have seen the car, Thomas said. Big black thing, looked like it rolled straight out of a rap video. And the guy? Suit, watch, all that flash. What did you pull him for? Thomas shrugged. Didn't like the look of it. His partner raised an eyebrow. You get anything on him? Clean. But you know how it is. Sometimes you just gotta remind people not to get too comfortable. His partner didn't respond. Just looked out the window. Even he could feel it. Something about the whole thing didn't sit right. Back at the office tower, Jordan stepped out of the elevator onto the 25th floor. It was quiet, professional. Sleek glass walls, clean lines, expensive lighting. A receptionist stood up immediately. Good morning, Mr. Bryant. We're so happy to have you here. He nodded politely, forcing a smile. Thank you. It's good to be here. But the truth was, his smile didn't reach his eyes. Not yet. Not after that morning. A staff member handed him his access badge, offered him coffee, and began a quick tour. Jordan tried to stay focused, taking in names and handshakes, but part of his mind kept drifting back to the sidewalk, the flashing lights, the stares from strangers as he stood helpless while a man with a badge searched through his belongings like he didn't deserve to own them. It wasn't the search that got to him. It was the tone, the doubt, the way the officer didn't even try to hide what he thought of him. Jordan's tour ended in his new office, a corner room with tall windows and a clear view of the skyline. It should have felt like a moment of triumph, but all he could feel was exhaustion. Emotional exhaustion. He sat down, opened his laptop, and stared at the screen for a few seconds. He hadn't said anything to HR. He hadn't told the receptionist. but it burned inside him. That was the thing about these moments. You carry them alone. They weigh more when you pretend they don't. Somewhere else in the city, Thomas had returned to the station. He was back in the break room, joking with a few officers, still riding the confidence of the morning. He didn't know, couldn't have imagined, that the man he tried to humiliate would soon sit across from him in a boardroom. In a position of power. In a moment that would flip his world upside down. The arrogance in his voice was loud. I don't care if he says he's a VP, doesn't mean I won't pull him again. People need to know there's a line. He had no idea how close he had come to crossing his own. Jordan, now reviewing company policy documents, heard a soft knock at his door. A staff member popped their head in. Just a heads up, sir. You'll be leading the sensitivity training workshop for the visiting precinct officers this afternoon. Your predecessor started the initiative. You're continuing it. Jordan looked up. Police officers? Yes. From local precincts. Community relations thing. HR said you'd be great. Jordan gave a small nod. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks. But inside, his chest tightened. He hadn't planned on facing it again so soon, but fate, it seemed, had other ideas. He looked out the window. The city still moved as it always did. But today, something had shifted. Lines had been crossed. And before the day was over, the man who had looked him in the eye and said, "You don't belong here," would walk into his building, sit at his table, and listen to his words. Jordan didn't believe in revenge, but he did believe in change. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of it. The clock struck just after 1 p.m. The conference room on the 25th floor was being prepared for the afternoon's special session. Neatly arranged chairs faced a sleek, long table. A projector buzzed quietly, warming up. Name tags and folders were placed in front of each seat, everything perfectly in place. The glass walls of the room offered a stunning view of the skyline, but the atmosphere was anything but relaxed. Jordan stood near the window, adjusting his tie. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, not just a man in a suit, but someone carrying something heavier than just job responsibilities. He was about to lead a workshop on bias, accountability, and building trust between police and the communities they served. Only hours ago, he had been standing on a public street, being humiliated by the very type of officer this training was meant for. He didn't want to make this personal, but it already was. He closed his eyes for a moment, drawing in a slow breath. Then, a knock on the glass door interrupted his thoughts. The HR director popped her head in, cheerful and unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. They just arrived. Officers from Precinct 12. About 10 of them. You ready? Jordan nodded once. Let's begin. Downstairs, Officer Thomas stepped out of the elevator, not in uniform this time. He wore a short-sleeve button-down and slacks, still carrying himself with that same sense of entitlement. He looked around at the clean, quiet office floor already, feeling uncomfortable in a space like this. Too clean, too polished. He didn't like it. Another officer walked beside him. What is this again? Sensitivity training? Yeah, Thomas muttered. One of those, let's pretend we care kind of deals. The other man chuckled nervously. Well, at least it gets us out of paperwork for the afternoon. They were greeted by a young woman with a headset and clipboard. Welcome, officers. Follow me. Conference room B, top floor. Thomas smirked, amused. Of course. Make sure we get the good view while we're getting lectured. The officers filed in, chatting among themselves, half joking, not expecting much. But the moment Thomas stepped into the room, his breath caught. There he was, at the head of the room, the man in the suit. The man from this morning. The man he had pulled over, searched, questioned, insulted, calm, composed, confident. And now, in charge. Jordan locked eyes with him, just for a second. No anger, no smug smile, just quiet control. That brief glance said everything without a single word. Thomas froze. He felt his face get warm, his collar tighten, his feet heavy like they were stuck to the floor. What was this? A setup? Was this a test? How could this be the same guy? Before he could process anything further, Jordan stepped forward. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mr. Bryant. I'm the Vice President of Corporate Relations here, and I'll be leading today's workshop. His voice was steady, clear, authoritative. He didn't mention the earlier incident. He didn't call Thomas out. But somehow that made it worse. Thomas sank into a chair near the back, suddenly wishing he had worn a tie. His hands fidgeted. On the table, he tried not to meet anyone's eyes. Jordan continued, pacing slowly. This session isn't about blame. It's about awareness. It's about seeing people before assuming things about them. It's about challenging the quiet habits we don't even realize we've learned. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't lecturing. But the words landed like bricks. Thomas couldn't stop sweating. Every phrase Jordan said seemed aimed directly at him, even though Jordan never looked directly at him again. Jordan went on, sharing statistics, telling real-life stories of profiling, of emotional damage that comes from small acts that pile up into lifelong wounds. He asked the group to reflect. He invited questions. And slowly, the tone of the room shifted. Officers began to listen. A few nodded. Some asked thoughtful questions. Except Thomas. He stayed quiet. He stared at the notepad in front of him, doodling in the margins just to avoid meeting anyone's eyes. His thoughts were spinning too fast to focus. This man, Jordan, wasn't just polished. He was powerful. He had presence, grace, poise. Thomas remembered how dismissive he had been earlier that day. He remembered the tone of his voice, the way he leaned into the window and spoke down to him like he was nobody. And now, he felt like he was shrinking in that chair. By the end of the session, there was a round of light applause. Some officers even approached Jordan to thank him, but Thomas stayed in his seat, frozen. Jordan closed his laptop and gathered his notes. He could have left, but instead, he looked up and said calmly, "Officer Thomas, can I speak with you a moment?" Tight. Room quieted. Thomas felt like his throat closed. This was it. He stood slowly, nodding stiffly, then followed Jordan into a nearby private room. The door shut behind them. Silence. Face to face again. Only this time the power had shifted, and both of them knew it. The small meeting room was quiet. The kind of quiet that made even the sound of breathing feel loud. Jordan stood near the window. Again, arms gently crossed. Officer Thomas stood by the door at first, unsure whether to sit or leave. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other like a student waiting outside the principal's office. Except this wasn't school. And he wasn't a kid. He was a grown man, a police officer. But right now, he felt small. Jordan finally broke the silence. "I wasn't going to say anything." Thomas looked up. "You could have walked out of here today and never known it was me. I could have let you sit through the whole session, take your notes, check your box, and be on your way." He didn't say it with pride. He said it like someone stating the weather. Calm. Clear. Thomas nodded slowly. "I didn't expect this. I didn't know." Jordan held up a hand. "That's the thing, isn't it? You didn't know, and you didn't care to ask. You just saw what you wanted to see." Thomas pressed his lips together, his throat dry. He wasn't used to being in this position. He wasn't used to listening. He wanted to speak, defend himself, explain, say something smart to save face. But he couldn't find a single word that felt right. "You didn't just pull me over," Jordan continued. "You humiliated me. You treated me like I was a criminal for existing in a car you didn't think I deserved. You searched my property. You asked questions that had nothing to do with safety. You made sure I felt small." He paused. "But here's the thing." Jordan looked at him now, really looked at him. "I didn't feel small. You did." Those words hit different. They didn't come from anger. They came from clarity. Thomas finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disrespect you." Jordan gave the faintest smile, not sarcastic, not bitter, just tired. "But you did. That's the part that matters." He let that sit. Thomas slowly sat down in the nearest chair. His shoulders had dropped, no longer squared with that same sharp pride he walked in with. His hands rested on his knees. "I've been doing this job a long time," he said quietly. "We're trained to look for patterns. We're told to trust our instincts." Jordan nodded. "And your instinct told you that a black man in a nice car must be a threat." Thomas didn't answer. Because it was true, and they both knew it. "I thought I was doing my job," he said instead, but the words sounded hollow. Even to him. "You thought wrong," Jordan said softly. "And that's the danger, officer. When your job becomes about assumptions instead of facts. When your gut becomes your compass, and your compass only points one direction." Thomas looked down. He felt like he was seeing himself from the outside. His badge, his power, his past. Choices. And he didn't like what he saw. "I wasn't always like this," he mumbled. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "What happened?" Thomas exhaled. "I don't know. Somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I just started seeing problems." Jordan stayed quiet. He wanted to hear the rest. Not because he needed it, but maybe Thomas did. "I joined the force because I wanted to help," Thomas said. "But the job changes you. The streets, the pressure, the things you see. You stop thinking, you just react, and eventually, you stop asking if you're right." Jordan listened carefully, then asked, "Do you want to change that?" The question wasn't accusing, it was honest, neutral. Thomas looked up, eyes tired. "I do. I don't know how." Jordan nodded once. "Then this is your chance." Silence again. But it wasn't the heavy kind this time. It was the kind that comes before something important. "You have a choice," Jordan said. "You can walk out of this room and pretend this never happened. Keep doing things the same way. Or you can carry this moment with you. Let it do something inside you." Thomas nodded slowly. "What would you do if you were me?" Jordan gave it a moment, then answered with quiet conviction. "I'd start listening more. I'd unlearn the noise I was taught, and I'd remember that every person you meet is more than the worst thing you assume about them." Thomas felt something in his chest loosen. Guilt, maybe. Or something deeper. Relief. He stood up. "Thank you for not embarrassing me in front of the others." "I didn't need to," Jordan said. "You're doing that work yourself now." They looked at each other. This time not as enemies, not even as opposites, just as two men in a world that desperately needed fewer fences and more bridges. "I hope you mean what you said," Jordan added. "I do," Thomas replied. "And I'm sorry. For real this time." Jordan nodded. "Then we start here." Thomas walked out of the room slowly, like someone who had just stepped out of a storm. He didn't say anything to the other officers, didn't make any jokes this time. He just left the building, got into his car, and sat there for a long moment. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking like a cop, he was thinking like a human being. The afternoon sun dipped lower behind the skyline as Officer Thomas sat alone in his parked cruiser. The radio crackled softly, but he didn't answer. He wasn't in the mood for chatter. The city was still bustling, people walking with coffee cups and briefcases, car horns echoing off the buildings, but everything felt muted to him now. like the world had turned down its volume and left him with nothing but his own thoughts. He stared at the steering wheel. His hands rested on it like they had 1,000 times before. But this time, he wasn't gripping it with control. He was holding it like he didn't know what to do with it anymore. What had just happened upstairs didn't feel like a lecture. It felt like a mirror. And he didn't like what he saw in it. He had built his whole identity around the uniform, the badge, the idea that he was a protector. A no-nonsense kind of man who did what others couldn't. That was the version of himself he carried around for years, the one that didn't question, didn't doubt, didn't apologize. But now, someone had looked him in the eyes and challenged that version of him, not with shouting, not with anger, just with truth. You didn't just pull me over, you humiliated me. Thomas replayed that moment over and over. He remembered how sure he was earlier that morning, standing next to that sleek car, convinced he had sniffed out a fraud, a faker, someone who didn't belong. But now that memory tasted bitter, not because he'd been wrong, but because he hadn't cared whether he was or not. That was the problem. He hadn't cared. Across the city, in his office, Jordan sat in silence too, but his thoughts were different. He should have felt powerful, vindicated, maybe even smug. After all, the man who had talked down to him in the street was now the one stumbling over apologies in his building, but he didn't feel any of that. Instead, he just felt heavy. He had kept his composure during the session. He had chosen professionalism over pride, principle over payback. But now that the door was closed and the lights dimmed in the conference room, Jordan let himself feel the emotional weight of the day. It wasn't about one traffic stop. It wasn't even about one officer. It was about every moment like it, moments he had experienced since he was a teenager. The quiet disrespect, the looks, the assumptions, the idea that no matter how hard he worked, someone would always think he didn't belong. That was the part that stung the most. He had worked his whole life to be good enough. Dress well, speak clearly, stay composed. But deep down, he knew none of that could protect him from judgment that arrived before he ever opened his mouth. And today proved it. Still, when Thomas had sat across from him, fumbling to explain, trying to make sense of his own behavior, Jordan had seen something that surprised him. Not fear, not defensiveness, but shame. Genuine shame. That was rare, and as much as Jordan hated what happened earlier, he couldn't ignore what had happened later. The shift, the crack in the armor, the discomfort that maybe, just maybe, meant change was possible. But change wasn't magic. It was a choice. 1,000 little choices every day to be better than yesterday, to pause before assuming, to question before acting, to listen before judging. Jordan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He wasn't here to fix people. That wasn't his job. But if today planted a seed, just one, that was something. Maybe that seed would grow, maybe it wouldn't. But he had done his part. That had to be enough. Later that evening, Thomas sat at his kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of a pencil tapping. The table? His daughter sat across from him, coloring in a book. She looked up. "Daddy, why are you sad?" He blinked. "What makes you think I'm sad?" She shrugged. "Your eyebrows are doing the thing." He smiled faintly. "Kids always notice the things adults tried to hide." "I'm just thinking," he said. "About work?" "Yeah." She went back to coloring. "Did something bad happen?" He paused. "No, but something important did." And that was the truth. He hadn't lost his job. He hadn't been yelled at. There was no lawsuit, no headline, no scandal. But inside, something had shifted. And that shift hurt in ways he hadn't expected. He stood up, walked to the sink, and stared out the window into the darkening sky. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't innocent either. He was something in between. And that space, the middle, was uncomfortable. It was full of questions and doubts and regrets, but it was also full of opportunity. The chance to be better, to do better. He wasn't there yet. But maybe today was the first real step. A few days had passed. The city had returned to its rhythm. Honking horns, tired baristas pouring coffee, commuters rushing through crosswalks. It was all the same from the outside, but inside two very different lives, something had changed. Officer Thomas had kept mostly to himself at the precinct. He didn't join in the usual banter. He hadn't retold the story of the morning stop like he normally would have. In fact, he hadn't told anyone about it at all. Instead, he had been thinking, quietly, constantly. It wasn't just about what had happened with the man in the car, Jordan. It was about what it revealed about him. Thomas had always thought of himself as a man of discipline, of justice. He wasn't perfect, sure, but he believed he was fair. Now he wasn't so sure. That moment in the boardroom, when Jordan had stood there, poised and powerful, speaking about empathy and respect, while knowing exactly what Thomas had done to him, had left something unsettled in his chest. It hadn't been revenge. It hadn't been a trap. It had been a lesson. And Thomas couldn't stop thinking about it. On the other side of the city, Jordan was finishing up a long day at the office. He stayed later than most, often finding peace in the quiet, after hours. The city lights glowed just outside the wide windows of his office. He sat at his desk going over a proposal when there was a soft knock on the door. He looked up, expecting a co-worker. But it wasn't. It was him, Officer Thomas. This time, in plain clothes again. His posture was different, not tense like before, not guarded like during their last conversation, just tired and sincere. Jordan stood slowly, unsure what this was about. He didn't feel threatened, just surprised. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Thomas said, voice low. Jordan shook. His head, "Not at all. You're back." Thomas stepped inside, awkwardly, like someone entering a stranger's home. He stayed near the doorway, holding his hands together. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "Actually, about everything. That morning, the training, all of it." Jordan nodded once, waiting. "I guess I came here because I didn't want that to be the last chapter of this. I didn't want your memory of me to be that guy on the side of the road. I didn't want that to be who I am." Jordan remained quiet, his eyes steady. Thomas continued slowly. "I've made mistakes. I see that now. Not just that day, but over years. Years of not asking enough questions, of walking into situations already convinced I know who people are, of never really listening." He shifted, glancing down. "I guess I'm here because I want to change, not because someone told me to, but because I finally understand why I need to." The room was still. Jordan let that sit for a long moment. He could hear the honesty in Thomas's voice. Not perfect, not polished, but real. And that was something. "You didn't have to come," Jordan said quietly. "I know," Thomas replied, "but I wanted to." There was a beat of silence. Then Jordan motioned to a chair. "Sit down." Thomas took a seat. He looked like a man who had spent a lot of time alone in his head. "I've started reading," he said. "Books, essays, stuff I ignored before, stories from people I never thought to listen to." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "And? It's humbling and hard. There's a lot I didn't know. Or maybe didn't want to know." Jordan leaned back slightly. "Most growth starts there, in discomfort." Thomas nodded. "I thought I knew everything I needed to know, but I didn't even know where to start." Jordan looked at him, then finally spoke. Start with this. Every person you pull over, every person you walk past, every name you see on a form, they're more than a uniform or a hoodie or an address. They've lived a life. You haven't seen, and if you walk into that moment thinking you already know who they are, you've already failed them. Thomas listened. Not like someone hearing a speech, but like someone trying to hold on to every word. I used to think silence was strength, Thomas said. Turns out, it's just comfort. It lets you avoid the hard conversations. I don't want to avoid them anymore. Jordan studied him. Then finally, he nodded. Good. Then let this be the start. A quiet moment passed between them, two men, once separated by a badge and a bias, now sitting at the same table, not as enemies, not even as a lesson, but as humans. I don't expect forgiveness, Thomas added softly. I just want to do better. Jordan stood and extended his hand. Then do better. Start with that. The rest will follow. Thomas shook his hand, firm but humble, and for the first time in a long while, they both felt something unexpected. Respect. Not given, not demanded, earned. As Thomas left the building and disappeared into the evening crowd, Jordan returned to his desk. The city lights still glowed, but somehow the air felt lighter. Maybe change didn't always come in loud moments. Maybe it began quietly, in a handshake, in an apology, in a willingness to listen. And that was enough for now. A week had passed since that unexpected meeting in the office. Jordan hadn't told anyone about Officer Thomas's visit, not his colleagues, not even his wife. It wasn't a story he needed to share, not yet. Some stories are meant to settle, quietly, before they find their way into the open. But the conversation stuck with him, not because Thomas said something groundbreaking, but because he didn't come with excuses. He didn't come to protect his pride, he came to listen, and in today's world, that alone was rare. That evening, Jordan sat on the back porch of his home, the soft hum of nightfall surrounding him. A warm drink in his hand, the sky painted, in quiet colors, deep blue, fading orange. His wife stepped out and sat beside him. "How was work today?" she asked. He smiled gently. Quiet, productive. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Still thinking about him? Jordan didn't need to ask who she meant. She'd seen it in his eyes ever since the day of the training. Yeah, he admitted, but not in a bad way. There was a pause between them, the kind that didn't need to be filled. "I think he's trying," Jordan said finally. "Really trying?" "Do you believe people can change?" she asked softly. Jordan nodded. "If they want it enough, if they're willing to do the hard part, looking at themselves." She smiled, resting her hand on his. "Then maybe you helped him more than you think." Jordan wasn't sure if that was true, but he hoped it was. He had no interest in revenge, no need for public apologies or empty gestures. What mattered to him was the seed, that something had been planted in a man who had once believed he had nothing left to learn. Sometimes that was how change worked, quietly, patiently. Across the city, Officer Thomas had also found himself living differently. Not loudly, but intentionally. He'd started noticing things more, the way he spoke to people, the assumptions that used to pop into his mind before someone even said a word. He didn't pretend they were gone. But now, he recognized them, and that recognition, that pause, was everything. He started driving a little slower in certain neighborhoods, not to monitor, but to see. He didn't look at people as profiles anymore. He started seeing individuals, young men walking home with backpacks, old men sitting on stoops, women pushing strollers. Just people. Living. Existing. No story written, for them in advance. One afternoon, he pulled into a corner store for water. As he stepped out, a young boy, maybe 12, froze when he saw the uniform. His eyes wide, shoulders tight. Thomas saw it, felt it, and this time, he didn't ignore it. He gave a nod and a small smile. "How's it going, kid?" The boy blinked, then slowly nodded back. "Good, sir." Thomas nodded again and kept walking. It was a small exchange, but not to that boy, and not to Thomas. Days. Later, a letter arrived on Jordan's desk. It was simple, no letterhead, just his name, handwritten on the envelope. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short note. "Mr. Bryant, I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the training, but for your patience. You didn't humiliate me when you had every right to. You didn't return the treatment I gave you. Instead, you gave me something I wasn't expecting. Truth, without hate." That day changed me. I don't know what kind of officer I was before, but I know the kind of man I want to be now. Sincerely, Thomas. Jordan read the note twice, then once more. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just sat, still for a moment, because what he felt was peace. Not everything had been fixed. The world was still the world, imperfect, messy, full of injustice. But this was a small piece of something better. A moment where dignity didn't lose. A reminder that the quiet work of change was still worth doing. Jordan folded the letter, placed it gently in the drawer beside his desk, and returned to work, and that was that. No press release, no viral post. Just two men, once strangers on opposite sides of a broken line, now connected by something fragile and honest. Growth. Later that night, Thomas drove home in silence. His daughter sat in the back seat, quietly humming to herself. She glanced up through the rearview mirror. "Daddy? Yeah? Did you help someone today?" Thomas looked at her, then back at the road. "I think I did," he said. And for once, he said it not out of duty, but out of hope. Because helping someone wasn't always about saving them. Sometimes, it was about changing yourself and letting that be enough.